William Alexander Morgan, aka the Yankee Comandante, was an American who held the rank of Comandante in the Cuban guerrillas during the revolution against the dictator Fulgencio Batista. But before I talk about his experience in the Cuban Revolution, post-revolutionary activities, and general messing around with the Castro regime, I need to talk about his background before Cuba. Morgan was born in 1928 and joined the U.S. Army in 1945 after the end of World War II. He'd be stationed in Japan with the 35th Infantry Regiment, where he went AWOL, was arrested, and escaped from custody by overpowering a guard. He escaped disguised as the guard but was recaptured. He was then court-martialed in 1948 and received a dishonorable discharge, and of course he spent over 2 years at a federal prison. Now this is where things start getting interesting. After his release from federal prison, Morgan, who was skilled with firearms, decided that the best fit for a dishonorable discharge was naturally to go work for the Mafia for a while. It was rumored that he had also been a Central Intelligence Agency operative during this time, though there are no public records or witness interviews to support this claim, but the CIA would pop up later, so keep that in mind. Morgan then made his way to Cuba in 1957, claiming to fight for the revolution against the dictatorship of Fulgencio Batista because he wanted revenge against the Batista regime for killing his friend Jack Turner, who had been a gun runner to rebels and was brutally tortured and fed to sharks by Batista. This would later be revealed to have been fabricated just so he could stay in Cuba. And he joined the guerrilla forces of the Second National Front of Escambray that operated against Batista's soldiers in the Escambray Mountains in central Cuba. The Second National Front had been a separate revolutionary movement from Castro's, but they were welcomed by Castro in a joint rebellion of common struggle. While traveling to the mountains with a driver and a rebel contact, Morgan's car was stopped by a military roadblock which let him pass when they saw Morgan in the back wearing an expensive suit, and they believed that he was an American businessman there to inspect coffee plantations. Once he arrived in the mountains, the rebels had to be sure that Morgan was not a KGB operative or a mercenary working for Batista's military intelligence. This was because in Sierra Maestra, Castro had recently discovered that a peasant within his ranks was actually an informant. The peasant, after being summoned, dropped to his knees and begged that the revolution take care of his children. He was then shot in the head by Castro, so the rebels were understandably paranoid. Through a translator, Morgan told the Second National Front's leader, Menoyo, his story about wanting to avenge his buddy's death and serving in the U.S. Army and his skills in martial arts and hand-to-hand combat, and said that he could train the inexperienced rebels in guerrilla warfare. Morgan argued that there was more to fighting than just shooting a rifle. And to demonstrate this, Morgan borrowed a knife and flicked it at a tree at least 20 yards away. It hit the target so squarely that some of the rebels gasped. Morgan had to prove himself, though, as the guerrillas tried to get him to leave by making him march up many hills and get cut up through the jungle. However, Morgan's time would come when 200 Batista soldiers came for the guerrilla base, and he devised a plan with Menoyo where more than a dozen of Batista's soldiers were wounded or killed in the battle. The rebels took the dead soldiers as guns and had lost no men on their battle. Afterward, they enlisted Morgan to teach them better ways of fighting. As Morgan won more battles, the news of his curious presence began filtering out. A Cuban rebels radio station reported that rebels led by an American had killed 40 of Batista's soldiers. Another broadcast hailed a Yankee fighting for the liberty of Cuba. He rose through the ranks, first commanding a half a dozen men, then leading a larger column, and finally presiding over several square kilometers of occupied territory. With his fame, however, U.S. and Cuban intelligence agents began picking up chatter about the Yankee Commando. In the summer of 1958, the CIA reported on El Americano, who had played a critical role in planning and carrying out guerrilla activities, and who had virtually wiped out a Batista unit while leading his men in an ambush. An informant from a Cuban group told the FBI that El Americano was Morgan, and another stated that Morgan had risked his life many times to save rebels and was considered a hero for bravely fighting and being extremely daring. Throughout the rest of the year, Morgan's troops were constantly outnumbered by 30 to 1 in battles and were routinely bombed by Batista's Air Force. At one point, the Batista government declared him dead in a fake photograph of a fat American body, which was initially a propaganda victory, but when Morgan and his guys liberated an area, he appeared to be invincible. In October, Che Guevara, who was another foreign comandante but for Castro's group, arrived to the Second National Front's positions and had a very rocky relationship with Morgan. The pair mutually distrusted one another and were opposites, as Morgan wanted democracy in Cuba and Guevara was a hardcore Marxist-Leninist. Although Guevara and the Second National Front reached an operational pact, friction remained between the two groups. The next month, in November of 1958, Morgan married fellow Second National Front rebel Olga Maria Rodriguez, who had also been a hardened fighter. Apparently, right after the ceremony, a battle against Batista's forces ensued as fighting was escalating for the final push against Havana. In December, Che Guevara joined forces with Morgan's group once again and the Directorio Revolucionario Estudiantil guerrillas of the Escambray Mountains. Together, they captured the cities of Santa Clara on December 31st. 12 hours later, Batista fled Cuba, and Morgan and his men occupied the city of Cienfuegos on January 1st and 2nd of 1959. The crowds greeted Morgan yelling Americano as he wrapped a rebel flag around his shoulders like a cape. Afterwards, he told a reporter that he was ready to just chill after the revolution. However, Morgan was worried about how the U.S. would feel about his activities in Cuba, and in March, the American embassy warned that participation in a foreign military jeopardizes citizenship. In the meantime, Morgan met Castro, who hadn't declared himself or Cuba to be communist, and therefore the two got along pretty well. At this point, he was approached by a CIA agent where Morgan confided that Guevara and Raul Castro were Marxist-Leninists who threatened the revolution. Guevara had enlisted someone to kill him, but Morgan had captured the agent and, before letting him go, obtained a written confession where he had stated that this is an insurance policy which will keep me alive. Morgan gained international attention once again in August of 1959 when he helped smash a coup attempt orchestrated by Dominican Republic strongman Rafael Trujillo and some of his former mobster colleagues by pretending to lead the takeover of the country while quietly divulging the plot to Fidel Castro and the Second National Front in order to help the fledgling government. The plotters had approached Morgan at a hotel in Miami and offered him $1 million to lead a counter-revolution in Cuba. You see, Morgan was now on the radar of the FBI and Attorney General Robert F. Kennedy for meeting with the mobsters, and they tried to catch him while he was orchestrating his elaborate plan to be a fake counter-revolutionary to stop the Mafia and Trujillo from attacking and invading Cuba. He even invaded the U.S. Coast Guard and getting the Mafia-backed forces to Cuba, where they were met by Castro and his troops. During a 5-hour televised address that lasted until 3 in the morning, Castro explained what had happened to the Cuban public. During the previous few months, he and Castro had spent hours scheming. Castro referred to Morgan as his prize double agent and hailed Morgan as a Cuban, and Morgan referred to Castro as his faithful friend. Menoyo recalled that they had complete trust in one another at this point. Afterwards, Trujillo was very mad and placed a $500,000 bounty on Morgan's head, which Morgan didn't really seem bothered by. Things were pretty good for him as he was now an even larger celebrity who the Cubans in the streets reached out to touch and awe. He also apologized to the FBI for not letting them in on his plot, and the ungrateful State Department decided to strip him of his American citizenship in September, but he held no grudge. Morgan lived a pretty good life in Cuba, and the peasants who now worked with him were doing a lot better for themselves as the guys saved their agricultural economy by digging irrigation systems. But things would take a dark turn when Castro's government became more and more leaning towards communism, which Morgan opposed. However, Morgan believed that Castro would keep the commies in line, but he was strongly mistaken. Castro would then declare Cuba to be a communist state, but in the middle of June 1960, Morgan and a select few former Escambray leaders met to discuss Castro's turn towards socialism and protecting the revolution. As the arrests of Morgan's former comrades for counter-revolutionary activities started to increase, Morgan organized weapons to be smuggled to counter-revolutionaries in the Escambray Mountains. Morgan's 2 personal bodyguards were also communist spies, and he was arrested by Cuban intelligence in 1960. In interrogations, he continuously stated that he would only talk to Castro. He became violently ill, and fearing that the government was trying to poison him, he made himself vomit to purge out any toxins. However, while imprisoned, Morgan slowly regained his strength with help from other prisoners, and they planned an escape, which wasn't successful. Olga, meanwhile, was placed under house arrest and escaped after crushing pills into the guards' drinks. She would then lead an attempt to rescue Morgan from his imprisonment by the communists, but it would be stopped by Castro where everyone was shot or arrested. However, Olga was able to escape for now. On March 11, 1961, shortly after a military trial at La Cabaña Fortress, Morgan was 32 years old and was found guilty on all charges in a kangaroo court and was shot by firing squad with Fidel and Raul Castro in attendance. Olga was then captured and told about his execution by a guard who she punched in the face before giving the police a chase and being recaptured again. She would be brutally tortured and sentenced to 30 years imprisonment, but was released after 10. In 1980, she was finally allowed to leave Cuba and was crammed on a boat full of other people wanting to leave. But as the boat left the harbor, a Cuban Navy cutter was firing at them. Bullets splintered through the hull as the boat slowly began to sink. It seemed that Rodriguez's life would end in a scene of cosmic cruelty. However, a U.S. Coast Guard helicopter arrived with another boat which rescued her and the other passengers. In April of 2007, nearly 50 years after the U.S. government stripped him of his rights in 1959 for serving in a foreign country's military, the State Department declared that Morgan's U.S. citizenship was effectively restored. Of course, there's a lot more to his story that I didn't get into this video, but did you know about William Alexander Morgan before this video? Are there other elements of the Cuban Revolution and its aftermath that you'd like for me to cover? Write in the comments, and thank you for watching.